Good evening, members and friends. I'd like very much to welcome you all this evening to our 17th webinar of the 2020 CV19 season, organised by the House Committee of the Club. This evening, we're delighted to have as a guest somebody from Down Under who stopped off on his way home some 40 years ago in what the Italians call RC. And rather like Julius Caesar, he came, he saw, and he conquered. Fortunately, our speaker did better and wrote and still writes about the Mediterranean. He's an absolute authority on cruising in those waters and its history. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Rod Heikell.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone in these strange times where we talk to screens, and I guess it's something which we'll have to get used to. What I'm going to do is talk about the book. It's subtitled A Short History of Yachting in the Mediterranean. It's actually not that short. It's 380 pages for starters. So we'll just jump to some chapters that I think you might find interesting. And what's going to happen is I'll just do a general run through, and then when we get to the chapters we're looking at, Lou will read out a little bit from the introductory bit of that chapter, and then I'll talk a little bit about other stuff on it. There will be plenty of time for Q&As afterwards, so don't worry, and you don't have to talk about the book. The genesis of the book was quirky, to say the least. I mean, for more than 30 years, I've been collecting academic papers, books, first editions on yachting and sailing in the Mediterranean. And a couple of years ago, we were in Göcek in Turkey, and a very nice young manager of one of the marinas there came round and said, you know, would I sign a copy of his Turkish pilot? And I said, of course I would. So the next morning he arrived and he had a first edition. And I said, look, you know, don't worry about this. You know, I'll get you a new edition. He said, no, it took me ages to find this first edition. And what I wanted to do is see what the coast looked like before I was born. Now, becoming an artifact when you're not quite dead is one thing, but you know, I looked at it, and Lou's just brought up, hopefully, the original plan I made in Göcek in 1983, and the last plan we made, which was 2018. As you can see in the original plan, there are no marinas in Göcek. 2018, there are 6, and I sort of started to realize that even, you know, between all the papers and books I had and the pilots themselves, dating from those early years, that there was a sort of repository of information here. And so, given that I was not doing well on another project, I thought, yeah, I'll just put this together. Of course, like all these things, it takes rather longer than you might imagine. But it's one of those things that I enjoy doing this sort of stuff anyway. So the book is basically 18 chapters. There's an introduction, and in the introduction, that just goes through, first of all, you need to establish some definitions of what a yacht is, what yachting is. And of course, those definitions have changed through the years. There's a brief bit on methodology, which I won't bore you with, and then a section on the Mediterranean, what the Mediterranean is, what sort of sea it is, what its seasons are like, what its history is like, and what our perceptions of the Mediterranean are like. So that goes through. Then we start with the Egyptians. First chapter really is on the Egyptians. And you might go, Egyptians, they didn't really do very much yachting. Well, yes, they did. A lot of boats which archaeologists at first thought were solar boats to take the dead pharaoh across the skies to eternity, had in fact got watermarks on them. And then more and more of these boats were discovered that are obviously being used. And there are also some interesting accounts in the Westcar papyrus, for example, in the Tale of the Turquoise Pendant. There's an account of a young pharaoh who's feeling a little bit depressed. So the high priest says, well, take a load of ladies, naked, comely, out onto the river in your yacht, and you will recover. And so I sort of thought, it just sort of has a strikingly awful modern ring to it, oligarchs and their big yachts and young ladies running around with not a lot of clothes on. And given I've been moored to a few of these, I can tell you this is not an exaggeration. After the Egyptians, the next chapter is on the Odyssey. And in fact, I was just talking about this earlier. The Odyssey is, I think, the wellspring of lots of the impetus for cruising. It's the idea of the anti-hero stacking everything against the gods and finally, overcoming and getting back. And it is, after all, the original layout for our first novels, our first fiction, really. Then we get to the Romans, and here we have some solid evidence. I'll let Lou just read the first little introductory bit of the chapter.
This is Caligula and Catullus, an unlikely couple. The Roman Emperor Caligula showed the same predilection for royal pleasure craft as had the Egyptians. Some commentators suggest that the huge craft he had built, the longest was some 70 meters long, were built by the demented Caligula to demonstrate to Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt that anything they could do, he could do better. In this case, we have not just written evidence, but the wrecked ships themselves, or at least photos of the excavated hulls. Benito Mussolini had the lake in which they were sunk drained and the hulls recovered. And then Catullus. All of this is a long way from the poems of Catullus and his loving descriptions of his little yacht and the voyages he made in it. It's a bit like parking your own modest cruiser next to a super yacht where the size of the tender on the super yacht is bigger than your own craft. Here, Catullus and Caligula are parked alongside each other in time. Catullus died around 54 BC, while Caligula was dispatched by his own Praetorian Guard in 41 AD, though their character and experiences are polar opposites.
So as Lou said from that little introductory bit there, Caligula had these boats built and then put on a lake just outside Rome, Lake Nemi. And, these weren't warships. These were wonderful, huge super yachts. They had wonderful tiled decks. They had statues of marbles. They had bars. They had nymphets. They had everything. And it's said this lake is actually sacred to Diana, the goddess of hunt, and that he called down to her to come down and join him at night. Anyway, the boats were sunk after Caligula was dispatched, and the locals knew they were there. There were various attempts to excavate and get them out and to raise them to the surface, most of which just destroyed bits and pieces. But then eventually, as it says there, Mussolini, in his idea of regaining some wonderful Roman Empire, had the lake drained and found two of the boats there. They're alleged to be three, but found two of the boats there, built a wonderful Art Deco museum, put them in there. And the picture on the right there is of Mussolini down inspecting the hulls which had been hauled out of the lake. Anyway, sadly, these photos are all we have, because in World War II, the Allies, thinking that the Art Deco Museum was some sort of military base, bombed it to smithereens. And all we have left are these old photographs and a few little models of what Caligula's boats looked like. Catullus, on the other hand, you know, some of us may or may not have read Catullus, but he was a wonderful, witty, acerbic poet. Died very young. I think he was a tad under 30 when he died. But he talks a lot about his yacht, about sailing the Aegean. Next one down is Catullus. There we go.
There it is.
And you know, he talks a lot about, you know, about the winds, the stars, and things like that, in a way where you know that he knew about sailing. That, you know, he wasn't just a passenger on this boat. And also, you know, there's this passion in his poems for his yacht, which, of course, like all yachtsmen, he said, is definitely the fastest in the world. So that's the Romans. The next chapter is on the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. There's very little to report on that, some bits and pieces. The most we have, funny enough, is from the Ottomans and the kayikis they had built. I think we've got, no, we don't have any pictures of that, it's all right. We can go back. And there they were used not just for crisscrossing the Bosphorus, but for parties. They used to go up for moonlit parties, all sorts of things. And that's the best we have. There's some other stuff on the Bucentaur, which the Venetians used in their ceremony to wed the Republic to the sea and other things. After that, we go to the sad chapter of the Romantic poets in Italy. And this is Byron and Shelley. The picture which is up is the only picture we have of Byron's Bolivar and Shelley's Don Juan, which was found in one of Shelley's notebooks after he drowned. It's a sad story. They were down in La Spezia. Shelley was in La Spezia, but Byron was in Pisa. And they engaged Trelawney to go up to Genoa and have these yachts built up there.
Shall I read the excerpt?
Yes, there's an excerpt. I forgot about that.
Okay, this is an excerpt from this chapter. The tangled history of Percy Bysshe Shelley and George Gordon Byron, more commonly abbreviated to just Lord Byron, and their self-imposed exile to Italy, was to end in tragedy and death. Shelley drowned off the shores of the western coast of Italy in 1822, Byron in the fever-ridden swamps of Missolonghi in Greece 2 years later. The two deaths are intimately bound up with the sea and the rivalry between the two poets, each vying to best the other, not only in verse, but also in their prowess on the water. Prior to moving to Italy, Byron and Shelley had come up with a plan for each of them to acquire or build a yacht to sail on the waters of the bay. It seemed to have been one of those plans that materializes out of an evening conversation and several bottles of wine, though of course Trelawney takes credit for planting the idea after a visit to Leghorn. He may well have. He was certainly instrumental in organising the project and commissioned a retired naval captain residing in Genoa to build the boats.
And Trelawney is our best witness to all of this, although Trelawney was always trying to out Byron, which takes some doing because Byron was quite a peacocky sort of chap anyway. But you know, his account is written some 40 years later, but is probably still the best account, and it adds up. I mean, in the picture that's there, Byron's Bolivar is, you know, it suits, you know, it's a spunky boat that, you know, somebody like Byron would want to have, whereas Shelley's boat is the small yawl on the other side, and it was 25, 26 feet long. And anyway, Trelawney and crew sailed Bolivar down to Livorno. Shelley followed with a young lad he had as crew and with his friend. And they got down to Livorno. And then 2 days later, Shelley decided to leave and go back, except there was a massive storm brewing. And I can tell you, and I'm sure any of you who have been around parts of the Mediterranean as there, in my case, it was off Corsica. When some of these thunderstorms come through, they are violent. They do have violent winds. Anyway, Shelley was overcome in his small boat, and the outcome was that they all drowned. They were washed up on the beach several days later, and because of the quarantine restrictions there, their bodies were burnt on the beach. Trelawney, of course, as he would, although most people doubt this, said he leapt into the flames and rescued Shelley's heart from the burning. But it's unlikely. He's buried in Rome, and to his credit, actually, Trelawney buried him near Keats. They all died young then. Keats had died of TB. Byron, of course, went on 2 years later, ended up in Missolonghi in the Greek War of Independence, and died of fever there. He was never the most robust specimen anyway, but you know, his was for sure an inspiration to the Greeks who were fighting there. And if any of you have been to Missolonghi, you'll know it's the weirdest place in the middle of salt lakes and mud flats, and in some ways a forlorn sort of place. It doesn't have the mountainous majesty of other places in Greece. After the Romantic poets was the chapter on French writers and artists in the Mediterranean. And I have to say, this was one of the chapters I enjoyed writing the most. I hadn't realized that all these people here were so involved with yachting. And Alexandre Dumas, we've got a bit there.
We do.
Right.
I've got
We've got a
another
bit.
excerpt from the book. The French take to the water, writers and artists in the Mediterranean. In the second half of the 19th century, French writers and artists discovered the Mediterranean and its extraordinary light and lightness of spirit, far from the dull cityscape of Paris and the grey beaches of northern France. For writers like Alexandre Dumas and Guy de Maupassant, the Mediterranean afforded a new life, an escape sufficiently distant from the intrigues and conspiracies of Paris, not to mention creditors, to reinvigorate the soul and fuel their writing. A part of this new life was to voyage on its waters in a yacht, and both Dumas and Maupassant had a passion for the sea and rode far and wide on their own yachts. Their taste for the Mediterranean was much removed from the notions of the grand tour that Shelley and Byron initially came for, and they didn't have that Victorian sense of a checklist of things to do and see while sailing around the Mediterranean. For them, there was the simpler pleasure of discovering the Mediterranean way of life and how to live it. The Mediterranean as a state of mind, a life on the water much removed from the rich and entitled visitors on stately yachts that oozed status and largesse, and not the simpler love of a sea and flapping canvas. There has always been a tension between the north and south of France, and it remains so to this day. The north is seen as venal and conservative, while the south more laissez-faire and inclined to the arts and radical thought. Painters, too, the Impressionists and Neo-Impressionists, flocked to the south of France to try and capture the essence of the light that informs many of the paintings of Manet, Cézanne, Seurat, Signac, and Matisse, amongst others. These were the painters who escaped from the studio and the stuffy conservatism of Paris and espoused the idea of working outside, en plein air, in a more intimate association with the landscape and the sea and the people around it. Paul Signac was a devoted sailor and, on his Olympia, sailed much of the Mediterranean coast and islands, recording the sea and coast in his bright Pontelier paintings. I have his Sails and Pines, a copy, of course, on the wall. Others occasionally sail with Signac, and on other boats. Any Impressionist and Neo-Impressionist catalogue is replete with pictures of boats in the sea around the coast of the Mediterranean.
And these were all characters and very different in their own way. Dumas was the ultimate party goer, you know. He was the hedonist par exemple. He loved to have people, and so on his boat, which was named after his mistress, and he is alleged to have had 40 mistresses, he sailed in the Mediterranean, and he was also a good friend of Garibaldi, who was instrumental, of course, in forming modern Italy. So when his good friend Garibaldi said, you know, could you come down to Sicily to help me and bring some, you know, help ferrying stuff around, Dumas said, of course. But as he himself says, you know, yacht travels very slowly. And then they had to go down the coast of Corsica and sample some of the food and wine there, and then parts of Sardinia. And eventually they got to Sicily when Garibaldi was pretty much finished doing, and you know, had pretty much accomplished and won the battles there with his red shirts. So he was willing, but he was a hedonist. Maupassant, on the other hand, went sailing for very opposite reason, to get away from people. As something of a hedonist in his early Paris years, he contracted syphilis, and through his short stories and his writing and things, it's apparent that he is slowly going mad and that the syphilis is eating away at his brain. But anyway, he was in the Bel Ami was his most successful novel. And Maupassant had, in fact, 2 Bel Amis that he sailed with 2 brothers who were his faithful friends. Signac, on the other hand, sailed all over the place, and his paintings often feature yachts in that pointillist sort of way. But actually, when he retired, he became the archivist and for the port of Antibes, and there he catalogued and drew all the harbours along the Mediterranean coast. It's sort of interesting history of the 3 of them. And while there may be others who dabbled in sailing, these 3 had their hearts in it. After the French, we come to, well, the Victorians. Now, the Victorians mostly sailed, as I said earlier now, with a tick list of things to see and do. You know, we have to see Naples, we have to see the Acropolis, we have to do this. And they also mostly sailed in what can be called super yachts today. There were very few of them, some, but very few of them who sailed in smaller boats. And most of the accounts we have anyway are of sailing in fairly large boats. And of course, there was, it also seemed that in a Victorian yacht, the piano was a critical piece of boat equipment. You always had to have a piano.
And the bath.
And a bath. And you also, you know, in it, you're not just seeing things, meeting people and having parties, but you also did a lot of hunting and shooting. You know, so you'd hunt boar in Albania and Turkey. You'd hunt quail in Greece. And you'd also try, although as one of them, the Earl of Cavan said, he said, you know, and he was writing in the early 1890s, said, you know, damn shame of it is that, you know, we can't get any decent shooting of lions anymore in North Africa. It's so, you know, it was a different era. One which is interesting, but for me doesn't have the flair of the French. So, I don't know. Are we going away? No, we're still here. So then after that, we have the Americans coming. No, that's not it. So we have the Americans in the Mediterranean. And of course, the most famous one was Gordon Bennett on Lysistrata. The exclamation Gordon Bennett is entirely deserved. He did things like in the south of France, for example, he had a theatre troupe on board. So enamored was he of the theatre troupe that he sailed off with them and wouldn't let them go back ashore until they'd done their whole repertoire. He hated playing cards. And so if he ever knew playing cards were being brought on board, he would have the aces removed from the pack. He hated beards. So he had an editor because, you know, he was the owner of the New York Herald, and had an editor with a beard who had to run round to every port to see him and eventually left in disgust. In his latter years, he lived in Beaulieu-sur-Mer, and he used to love to go to one of his favorite restaurants in Monaco. Anyway, when he arrived there and found that he couldn't, or the owners wouldn't give him his normal table on the terrace in the corner, he promptly bought the restaurant and gave it to the head waiter. This was Gordon Bennett, incredibly rich, entitled, a wonderfully eccentric man. So after the Americans, we get the years leading up to World War II. In those years, of course, you know, you had the Great Depression, you had World War I, you had the rise of fascism in Italy and in Germany. These were troubled times, and most of the touring seemed to be on big boats again, except for the one exception, and that is of, what's his name?
Which one?
RCC, the diary, it's up here.
McPherson?
McPherson. It's McPherson, who, coming back from India at the age of 62, decided that he wanted to go sailing. So he sailed all over the Atlantic and then down around the Mediterranean. And in this, and in the beginning of things like the Cruising Association and other clubs, we can see the rise of people sailing with friends or with shipmates, as opposed to crew and servants. There is something of a sea change going on here. After World War II, there's an interesting period where there is not quite a rush of people going down to the Mediterranean, but certainly a whole pile of people who probably, like my father, who was in North Africa and Monte Cassino, were disturbed, and this whole war had changed their mindset, and so we have people like George Miller, awarded all sorts of medals, including French medals for his role in SOE. Yes, we have something to read here as well. Mm-hmm. There goes Lou.
This is a little bit on this part of the book. The Second World War left the shores of the countries around the Mediterranean devastated. And yet the desolation of war can give rise to strange yearnings and inexplicable cravings for a different way of life, away from the humdrum and grey horizons of home. Just a few years after the end of the Second World War, George Miller decided to sail from England down to Greece. And this is an excerpt from his book. It so happened that we considered making a voyage to Greece in a small boat at a time when the British people, fatigued by war, the grimness of continuing rationing and emergency laws, and the exhausting process of Britain's inevitable political earthquake, speeded and intensified by the war, were suffering from lethargy. Isabel reacted with energy inversely proportional to this lethargy. I know that one can get anything in England if one takes the trouble to look for it. Is it illegal to buy a yacht? No. Well, we are going to buy one. And that's from George Miller's Isabel and the Sea.
George Miller was just one of several who, after the war, had decided that they'd better get on with the business of living. They'd seen death so close and come so close to death that they ought to do it. And Ernle Bradford was another, and his first book, he wrote lots of others subsequently, The Journeying Moon. He takes an old Dutch botter down to the Mother Goose, down to the Mediterranean. And again, he relates how he was I think he was in North Africa, and was reading one of the Greek classics, which basically said, if you don't grasp life, then it will slip through your hands, and you will never do it. So you should get off and do it. And this is what he did as well. I mean, because these were hard times. Crabbe was Penny Minnie, and lots of others who in the early 50s were young and undergraduates. And not only were they two young women, but they loved sailing. And so they went to Malta and bought an old ex-ship's lifeboat, which is the one in the picture, which had a rig on it, made a few modifications, and then sailed it from Malta to Sicily, cross around the boot of Italy, cross to Greece, and then through Greece and up and around to Istanbul. And ostensibly, Penny said, that we were doing this because to show that ancient ships could have sailed these waters, and so it was part of our graduate work. In fact, they were just out there having a ball, and it's an interesting book, Crabbe's Odyssey again, on this trip. So saying made in the 50s. There were lots of others, of Hammond Inns, who sailed down around there. Again, these are people where the war had disturbed their mindset in lots of ways and they wanted to leave. Now, after that chapter, we then get to The Rich and the Super Rich, Part 1, which is Greek tragedy. And this is the story of Onassis, of Creole and Stavros Niarchos, and of another boat which I came across when I was writing Greek Waters Pilot, Argonautis. But for Onassis, he had the Christina built, and when he came to Skorpios in the Ionian, he had this island which he'd bought and developed. It had wonderful trees on it, had a little farm on it with cows, so they had fresh milk. It had quarters for all the staff who lived there. Had a big mooring buoy in the sheltered part between the island of Skorpios and Skorpidi. And that's where he moored Christina and lived on Christina. He didn't go ashore to the island very often, although he is buried there on a little promontory on the corner, along with his son and his daughter. Stavros Niarchos had Creole, and that ended quite badly, and there's a lot of bizarre relationships going on here when Niarchos is thought to have assaulted Onassis's ex-wife and on the Creole, and after that he sort of left her. He had resurrected her from a wreck just after the war on the south coast of England, and shed loads of money into it, and loved it apparently. But then it all went sour. Not only that, but Gucci, what's his first name? I can't remember. Bought the boat and was subsequently living on the boat with his mistress, which his wife didn't like very much. And so she hired an assassin to kill him on the steps of his office in Milan, I think it was, or Turin. But so there was a lot of sort of tragedy going on. Argonautis, the last one I mentioned briefly, when I was writing, doing a research for the first edition of Greek Waters Pilot, I was weatherbound in Porto Carras and the Halkidiki briefly, and there was me, a couple of other yachts, and the Argonautis, which is, I think from memory, 190 foot long, three-masted schooner.
Now known as.
Yeah, now known as Flurchy, but then was known as Argonautis. And so inevitably, I wandered around there and I got talking to the first mate, and we had some beers and things. And I asked him, because what was odd was there were big iron shutters that came down over the windows, and also the boat looked absolutely ready to go. It wasn't abandoned. So the first mate told me that Carras, the owner, had it there all ready to go to sea in case there was a nuclear war. And this boat could close down, go out to sea, and stay out there it had carried a lot of water, a lot of fuel, and had this three-masted schooner rig, which was staysail rig, which was easy for a small crew to run. I have no corroboration for that story, so you just have to take it, and I say in the book, it is anecdotal on my part.
I'm just going to jump in here slightly and say, well, we're sort of 40 minutes is kind of up. So if you want to know more about the book, I'm afraid you're going to have to buy it. But more on that later. If that's if everybody's happy, I think we're going to hand back to Tim to
the last one.
Sort of. Oh,
yeah. Look, with everyone's everyone seems to be extremely interested in this. So if you want to keep going for another 10, 15 minutes, I don't think anyone would mind, to be honest. So
okay, I'll do another 5 or 10.
We do.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Philip. Okay, so after that Greek tragedy, there is, of course, the flotilla story, and I was involved in that from the early days. It's long and involved and quite interesting in its own way, but I'm not going to dwell on that. The next chapter is 1960s to the 20th century, which just charts really the development of yachting in the Mediterranean and how yachting started to take off. The chapter after that, because we've been talking about super yachts and, you know, charter yachts now and all sorts of things, is doing it on a shoestring. And in here, you know, we have my friend Steve Clark-Lenz, who did 4,000 miles on a wayfarer from the Ionian down to Crete and then across to Egypt, up the Nile and back, and then to Turkey and then back to the Ionian. So yes, and we have, you know, some Drascombe luggers and things. And we have Chris, who got in touch with me for a different reason. He was having problems getting his little boat in through customs in Italy and wanted to know if I could help. Anyway, as things went on, we sort of became friends, and he told me that, you know, sort of 50 years ago, as a young boy in Naples, his father was based there. He'd sailed a lightning dinghy, which is it's much like a wayfarer, except in the pictures it looks slightly less seaworthy. So he'd sailed that from Italy down around the bottom of Italy, across to Greece, and then up to the Sporades and back to Piraeus. And that was, you know, and he had the log from it, so he sent me the log, and so I include him in this section on, you know, doing it on a shoestring. The best bit is that he's decided after 50 years to come back to retrace this journey, but, you know, he's not doing it in any super big boat. He's doing it on, it's 22, oh, I've forgotten the name of it, but Enosis, the one in the picture. Which he sailed all around, you know, around lots of parts of the States. And, you know, he says, you know, as Ernst Shoemaker said, small is beautiful, you know, it works for us. And, but of course he, and I was just talking to him recently, he, of course, like all of us, is now marooned in the lagoon of COVID-19. So you know, but it's a very nice story. And I think after that, there's another chapter on the rich and the super rich, which is just about super yachts. It's, you know, it's interesting in its own way, and it charts that part of it. And then there's a chapter on yacht charter today. Then there's the second to last chapter is on the Med today. And in that, I do talk about global warming, which I was mentioning briefly before. Global warming, I believe, is going to have a significant effect on the way we sail. I see in this hurricane season this year, is going to be, you know, a really big hurricane season. And we're getting these things in the Mediterranean. This is, they're very like hurricanes. They're called medicanes. And you can see they have that circular eye. They have very strong winds up to hurricane force and over. And this one was Zorbas, which was in November 2018. We were in fact further up the Ionian. We were okay, but we still had 50 knot winds or so. But there were boats sunk. There were a lot of boats damaged, and this is something I think, you know, we all need to be aware of climate change and the fact that, you know, it's not just going to mean we have a few nice hotter summers. It is going to radically change the sort of weather we have. You can tell probably that I'm a bit of a greenie in this respect. So the last chapter, which is not on here, I don't think. I don't know what's next. No, doesn't matter. Just leave that there. Is just on pilots. It's from the Periplus of Skylax to the digital age, and of course, you know, I have a bit in there on my own insider view of writing pilots. One of the things I found interesting is that Portalands from the 14th to the 17th, 18th century, Portalands, which were, if you like, the maps and instructions used by people sailing around the Mediterranean and elsewhere, had all sorts of things in them. So you had, you know, you had information on what you might find ashore, whether they're friendly, you can get water, you know, whether the harbour was safe, what winds were dangerous, all of these sorts of things. Then we sort of have a period where, and we're moving to the Admiralty, things were divided up. And so you got Admiralty sailing directions and charts, you know, so you get charts of harbour plans. And this sort of divided up the information. What is interesting is that pilot guides, you know, which started with people like Denham, the RCC, and all sorts of other people who have written pilots, went back almost to the Portaland style, where you have harbour plans, information on what's there. Thankfully, most of the natives are friendly these days. And so you had this amalgamation of information again, which works. Philip was probably going to say this, but I'll say it anyway. Of course I want you to buy the book, but I'm a rubbish salesman, really. But the best, for Ireland, the best deal at the moment, and I looked it up and it seems to be so, is off Amazon. Now, I'm not best friend of Jeff Bezos, unfortunately, but, and I do like little independent bookshops, but the problem from here is postage. And Amazon has it on special at £25.60, I think, which is a price no one can match. But I'm pretty sure that if you spend over £25, you get free postage. And that's the killer. I mean, I looked it up. If I sent you a copy, it'd cost me, because I don't have a contract, around £12.
So signed copies will be more expensive.
Yes. So that's it. That's the gift of the sea. Now, when you have any questions, you honestly don't have to stick with that. You can grill me over.
Could be anything.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great, Rod. Listen, thank you very much, and beautifully read as well, Lucinda. So look, if you just like to ask a few questions, then you can fire ahead on the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can raise your hand. I will say something. I'm not. I don't know with the whole Jeff Bezos thing, but a lot of the local bookshops over here are sort of replicating Amazon just for the people, just to say you can actually phone them up and they will order the book for you. So
okay,
that's even
that's even better.
Yeah. There's a big drive going on really to sort of do that. Just a couple of questions. A question here from Ben. He was just asking, just when you're talking about the weather there, was that from your own experience, or were you talking to locals at the same time who noticed these big differences that you think are on the way?
Oh no, we were there. As I said, we were for Zorbas. We were in Levkas, further up the coast, and you know, it was staying up all night time, motoring off the quay to stay there. But a lot of the information we have comes from people, you know, it's, 40 something years now, Philip, I've been around. So obviously, some of them, I knew as kids, and now I've grown up and got charter companies or yacht agencies. And so the best information really comes from them. So a lot of charter companies, a lot of, yacht service agencies, that sort of thing. And, marina managers and owners.
I think there's also sort of documented, statistics on or water temperature. Seawater temperature is massively higher than it has been. And of course, that all feeds into bigger and more destructive storms. So what would have been a reasonably average sort of thunderstorm on a front can now actually generate itself much into a much bigger system, partly because of the water temperatures.
The other thing I would say is that, I have documented things, so the book does have footnotes, and has 5 pages of bibliography, and there are a couple of papers in there from Meteo departments on the formation of these metacanes. There have been more than you might think. I think there have been 19 recorded in the Mediterranean.
That's great, yeah.
The thing is now, these metacanes are becoming more frequent.
Yeah, no, that's great. The more information, the better, isn't it? Just a question here from Philip Main. Then he asked, did Beaufort's Caramania stimulate any British to sail down the coast of Turkey in the early mid-19th century?
I don't think it. There was a boat called the Royalist, which went down around there, but that was a bit later, using Beaufort's charts, because Beaufort also mapped a lot of that area for the Admiralty, and they're beautiful. I mean, I've before they were withdrawn from the Admiralty, I bought some sheets of these as new charts just to keep, because they are works of art. But Beaufort's Caramania mostly deals with the interior, and I don't know how much. Beaufort wasn't the only one. There were all sorts of people down there. Spratt is another one of my favorites, who also mapped, lots of the Aegean. But he was also, as in those days, scampering ashore we lost.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. That's just the book cover. If you want to put it back up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So these guys were, these were Renaissance men who were always scampering ashore to do a bit of botany, a bit of geology, a bit of archaeology, and anything else they could.
Fantastic. Must have been fascinating times. Drury Pearson just asked, he said, how come there are no pilot books of the Black Sea, and why is insurance so difficult to obtain to sail there?
I don't know. We have a short section on the Turkish pilot on the Turkish North Black Sea coast, but partially because, relatively few boats go up there. So, when you go to a publisher, he's, in the early days, for example, after doing Greek, Imre's, I said to Imre's, well, I can do Turkey now because I popped in and out of Turkey a few times anyway. And they said, well, how many boats are there? And I had to be honest and go, not a lot, really, in those early days. So then, then after that, I did Italy and then Turkey.
From the insurance point of view, I think it's kind of, I suspect to a point it's kind of historic, and with Georgia and the other countries, particularly around the east and
Russia,
and north side of the Black Sea, it's pretty complicated bureaucracy, and I suspect that the insurance is probably linked to that in terms of difficulties and possibility of getting a bit stuck. But there is a inroad guide to the Black Sea, isn't there?
Yeah, there is.
But
It's quite old now, but
yeah,
it still is.
Okay, there's a question here from Kean Gallagher, who asks, or says, thanks so much, Rod and Lucinda. Was in Bizerte, is that how you pronounce it, in Tunisia. He was there in 2018 en route to Greece. He said, great reception, despite the cockroaches in the shore side. And he asks, how well do you see other North African countries opening up for visiting yachts over the coming years, e.g. Algeria, Egypt, Morocco? Are they improving?
Well, Morocco certainly is. You know, they've been building a few new marinas. Algeria is, it's difficult because I don't think, you know, with the Brotherhood, you still have a really stable government there yet. And Libya, of course, is a bit of a no-no. Egypt, you know, there are a few quite bizarre marinas down the Red Sea. Port Galib is one where, you know, you've come up from nothing, from ferrying water ashore, from always anchoring to moor in this huge marina with Starbucks and Cafe Rouge and TGI Fridays. I mean, you know, it is just surreal.
It's difficult to see much changing in you know, many countries along that shore. Algeria, I think could be interesting because I think there's a sort of rising interest generally in terms of trade and that sort of thing with Algeria, and of course that's what will drive any further developments. I mean, obviously they have massive new container port that they've built along shore there, but no, for now, I mean, Tunisia, Morocco are really the only you know, places where you can cruise as such, and without having to jump through lots of hoops.
Mm-hmm. Do you think for cruising for the length of time that you have, did you sort of prefer the old anchorages versus these sort of Starbuck marinas as somebody who's seen both of them, really, or the sort of development of them, you know?
I was really happy to see that one coming up the Red Sea. You're pretty grateful for anywhere where you can find some water and
plug into electricity.
Yeah,
that kind of thing. But no, generally, I don't know. I think we like a mix of anchorages and harbours, and if you can marry a marina to the centre of a city, which we're, you know, many places in the Mediterranean you can, then hey, you know, what a treat to be able to sail in virtually into the centre of a city and be able to park your boat there. You know, I think that's a real treat.
Lovely. Okay, just we have two more people. This is from Adrian Masterson. Now, I'm hopefully going to pronounce his word correctly. He said, has Rod come across the wonderful Antikythera mechanism?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's
Adrian said it was found on the wreck of the Peloponnese, and it was capable of predicting movement of the planets, even allowing for leap years. And he says it has been partially restored and has been shown to have been remarkably accurate. And he says, P.S. the mechanism is over 2,000 years old.
Yes. No. The Antikythera computer is, you know, I've mentioned it various times in books. And also, you know, we've been to see the original, which is not as good as the reconstructions of the original because, you know, it's pretty corroded. But there have been some amazing things where they've used various X-ray machines to work out what all the little groove discs and cogs and things were doing, and have constructed a replica of it.
They're still working on it, aren't
they? Are,
because they you know, when they get a new piece of technology that can view better inside it, you know, so it's very non-destructive sort of testing, and so they'll go back to it again and go, oh, I think we can use this this machine on it to see, and they're still discovering exactly how it worked and how clever it was. It's remarkable, absolutely remarkable.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? 2,000 years old. Okay, and then finally, from Des here, just asks, what do you think of the accuracy of Ernie Bradford's account of the Odyssey in Ulysses?
Spot on.
Spot on, really? Okay. Can you elaborate on that?
No. Ulysses Found, I think, is probably one of the better books on where Odysseus might have gone. But I do think he makes some mistakes over the island and where the islands were around Sicily and other places. Years and years ago, I helped Tim Severin when he was doing the Ulysses voyage, and he maps it out purely around Greece. So from Troy, from up near the Dardanelles, you come down through the Aegean, up around the Peloponnese to Previtsa, and then bang back to Ithaca. It doesn't really work for me, but all of these accounts are interesting. There's also a book by Bittlestone, which says that the real Ithaca is actually the little chunk that's off the side of Kephallonia, that could have been separate in ancient times, and Odysseus is still was a time of
geologically speaking, it's slightly different. That side of Argostoli, Lixuri, and that sort of.
But I've also got a good friend who, sort of, if you like, a more traditional archaeologist in Athens, who says, no, original, that's where it is.
Good stuff. And then we just have a thank you here from David Beattie. He's Commodore of the ICC of the Irish Cruising Club, and he just said, on behalf of the members of the Irish Cruising Club who have joined this talk, I would like to thank Rod and Lucinda for a marvellous voyage to the Med, and the Royal Irish Yacht Club for their inviting us to join it. And that's from David Beattie. He's Commodore of the ICC.
Yeah, very kind of them.
Very kind. Thank you. Well, no, thank you all. Well, thank you at the Royal Irish Yacht Club for organising this and inviting us, and thank all your members for joining us. It's been great.
Great stuff. And the book is available on Amazon. Just to anyone that did actually miss it, just log on there and. You can
bookshops can order it,
or maybe give the Irish bookshops a go and try it there. But Amazon does have it though. Okay, listen, thank you very much, Rod and Lucinda. I'll now hand you over to Winifred McCourt.
Okay, Rod and Lucinda, listen, that was a wonderful talk. I think you've got a big fan base here in the Royal Irish Yacht Club. We've all been cruising and relying very much so on your guides. So thank you so much for taking the time this evening to talk to us. We would hope to see you at some stage in person, or both of you back in the club eventually. And very much looking forward to talking about the Odyssey to you as well. And so on behalf of the Royal Irish Yacht Club, I'd like to say a very big warm thank you and good night to everybody in the Royal Irish Yacht Club. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.